So we are moving along in the Amidah to the second bracha of the Amidah. We finished the first one. So if you are in Siddur Sim Shalom for weekdays, it's on page 36, A or B. Take your pick. If you are in Sim Shalom for Shabbat and festivals, it's on page 115, A or B. So the first bracha was called Avot, and we talked about that, meaning either ancestors or fathers. We talked about the imahot, the mothers, the matriarchs, and now we're moving on to the next bracha, which is Gevurot. Gevurot, you may have heard the word gibor. A gibor is like a hero or a mighty one. Gevurot means mighty acts. And I think about this bracha as really a listing of things that exist, let's say, that exist in the world that are manifestations of divine power. Right? So that's my the personal way that I relate to the themes of this prayer, and hopefully I'll be able to show that. But when we talk about Gevurot, we're specifically talking about Gevurot performed by God, right? Heroic, mighty acts performed by God, or manifestations of divine power in the world. Okay, so here's what the bracha is in its entirety. Now I'll point out that we've had two different kinds of brachot that we've seen in our services. Or really three different kinds of brachot. There's brachot that are simply Baruch Atah to the end, a single sentence. We have more extended brachot, which begin with a Baruch and end with a Baruch. So if you think about the opening of the Amidah, which began Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu, right? And then it ended Baruch Atah Hashem Magen Avraham. And then if we add the matriarch, Ufoked Sarah. So we start with a Baruch, we end with a Baruch. That, and then that with everything in between constitutes one bracha. Now the third kind is, let's say, has an expansion, has lots of words, ending with a baruch, but doesn't start with a baruch. So that's what we've got here. As you can see, the opening words are Atah Gibor, not a baruch opening, but it ends with Baruch Atah Hashem Mechayeh HaMeitim. So let's see what we talk about. We jump right in. Atah Gibor le'olam Adonai, Mechayeh Meitim Ata Rav leHoshia. There, that's better. Okay, so Atah Gibor, you are a Gibor. You are a mighty one. Le'olam, forever. For eternity, Adonai. Now here it says Adonai, it's spelled out, which means my Lord. So you are a hero for eternity, or you are eternally mighty, my Lord. We've just introduced the theme of this blessing, and then we jump right into the details. Mechayeh Meitim Ata Rav leHoshia. So Mechayeh Meitim, you give life to the dead. Rav leHoshia, and have great power to save. Something like that. Rav means a lot, abundant. LeHoshia is to save. It's a little bit tricky to translate this directly into English in a way that makes sense. Michael, what do you have for this prayer?
Most of the Mitayim are replaced with Hakol.
Okay, so Meitim means dead, Hakol means everything. So instead of saying you give life to the dead, most Reform liturgies have changed it to you give life to all, or give life to everything.
In Mishkan, they give you the alternative.
Okay, so they brought it back as an option, the traditional one. Okay, so we're gonna look at that particular phrase in more detail. Susan, you're muted, Susan. You'll have to unmute.
You'd think that 6 months in, I would remember to unmute. So I just wondered how progressive, conservative justify Mechaye Metim?
Well, that's an excellent question. What do we mean by Mechayeh HaMeitim? Well, I'll look at the Siddur Sim Shalom translation. It says, "You give life to the dead." For this Mechayeh HaMeitim. Well, I'll take a glance at it. Does anybody have Lev Shalem open with them? I'm going to grab it off my shelf if you don't mind.
Sorry if I'm being offensive by asking that to people more rooted in the conservative movement.
Oh no, that's not.
No, it's a good question. I'm wondering too.
Okay, so let's see. I'm looking at Siddur Lev Shalem. It does not include Hakol as an option. Here it says you give life to the dead.
And what exactly does that mean?
Well, we'll talk about what that means. So, but all right. So then we have this indented phrase from Shmini Atzeret to Pesach. So Shmini Atzeret is right at the end of Sukkot through Pesach. So basically the winter months. Mashiv haruach u'marit hageshem, cause the wind to blow and the rain to fall. Right. So today we've got the wind blowing quite mightily, and
That's for sure.
in about an hour we should be having some rain falling. Mechalkel chayim bechesed, so you sustain life with chesed. We've talked about this word many times. It appears repeatedly. Loving kindness, so this is kind of a covenantal expression of love by God. Mechaye meitim barachamim rabim. Again, we have mechaye meitim. Give life to the dead with great compassion. Somech noflim, support the fallen. V'rofeh cholim, and heal the sick. Umatir asurim, and free the captive. Umakayem emunato lishenei afar, and keeps his faith with those who sleep in the dust. Michamocha Baal Gevurot, who is like you, master of might, really, master of mighty acts, I might say. Umi do melach, and who can be compared to you? Melech, memit u'mechayeh u'matzmiach Yeshua, king who brings death and who gives life and who causes salvation to sprout. V'ne'eman ata la'chayot meitim, and you are faithful to give life to the dead. Baruch atah Hashem mechayeh hametim. Blessed are you, Adonai, who gives life to the dead. How many giving life to the dead did we have in this prayer?
A lot.
Three, I think 3 times probably.
It's actually five times.
Oh, really?
Mechayeh meitim up here. Mechayeh meitim. Then we've got memit u'mechayeh, la'chayot meitim, and mechayeh meitim.
Wow.
So we've got 5 separate, uses of those, the giving life and dead, like as an expression together. 5 times, right?
Rabbi?
They must have meant it. Yeah. Yes.
Can I share the wisdom of babes with regard to the gives life to the dead?
Sure.
So when Nathan was a preschooler, he asked me a question about how did it go? He was meaning to say before we're born. And when he said before, back when we were dead. And I thought it was the cutest thing in the world, because if you talk about the before and the after, and it's all that we're back with God, right? I praised him a lot for his cute little statement.
Insight.
Yes.
We'll see if he had some rabbinic insights.
I just want to interject. I remember when Natasha said to me when she was 3, I understand how the baby comes out, but how does it get in?
And what did you answer?
I don't remember what I said. I may have just nodded my head.
Yeah. Okay. Other than, all right, so we've drawn out the giving life to the dead theme. We briefly mentioned the wind blowing and the rain falling. What other themes did we just mention here?
Dust, sleeping in the dust.
Yeah.
That's a really cool idea.
Yeah. Mekayem fulfills his faith to those who sleep in the dust. Yeah. Keeps his faith. Yeah.
So those also is related to the Meitim.
Yeah, so those who sleep in the dust are the dead as well, right?
Yeah.
So we have six
Maybe we have a
times.
sixth reference. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I always interpreted that as, the homeless or the otherwise marginalized.
Okay, that's a possibility as well. We'll see.
But rabbinically, you're probably right that it's the dead.
We had a Somech Noflim Rofei Cholim Matir Asurim. That ring a bell?
From the morning blessings.
Yeah, so we've got certainly on Somech Noflim is one of the morning blessings. It's also the Samech line in Ashrei, Somech Adonai L'chol Hanoflim, and then Vizokef Lakafufim, right? God supports all those who are fallen. Matir Asurim, frees the captive. That's another one of the morning blessings. Rofei Cholim, heals the sick. That's coming up in the Amidah. So we've got some themes here, but by placing them inside this blessing, we're characterizing these divine acts as being demonstrations of God's power or of divine power, right? And at least, going, let's say, into the pre-modern era, any sort of medical cure may in fact have been seen as something divine, something that humans really have little to no control over. And of course, we also, Matzmiach Yeshua, cause salvation to sprout. We kind of have a reference in here to a messianic belief. And of course, the idea of resurrection of the dead is also very much tied in to Jewish messianism. All right, so this is the prayer. Now let's see if we can discover something about it. Tchiat hametim is the term that refers to the resurrection of the dead. Mechayeh hametim would be the verb, resurrecting the dead, bringing life to the dead. So this is from the Mishnah. I'll make myself a touch smaller. Here we go. This is Mishnah Sanhedrin, chapter 10, Mishnah number 1. This chapter is referred to as Perek HaChelek, the chapter of Chelek. Chelek because it's one of the opening words in the verse. Chelek means a portion. Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek la'olam haba. All of Israel have a portion in the world to come. This chapter is what led Maimonides in his commentary on the Mishnah to, I guess, come up with his 13 principles of faith. Because this chapter gets, as we're going to see in a moment, gets into a lot of theological statements that seem to be mandatory for a Jew in order to gain an entry into the world to come. At least that's how Maimonides takes it. And then he, based on that, identifies these 13 core principles that he says every Jew must accept. He calls them ikarim. So, but the Mishnah, remember, Mishnah, we're talking 2nd century, the Common Era. This is the rabbis. And, they're a small group at this point. These are the same people who have come up with the framework for the service that we have today. Here, we're not talking about services, but we're going to see this theme of resurrection of the dead as it appears in the Mishnah. And so it's going to tell us something about the theology that was important to the rabbis. All right, so we say, Kol Yisrael yesh lehem chelek la'olam haba, shene'amar, ve'amech kulam tzadikim la'olam yirshu aretz, netzer mata'ai, ma'aseh yadai, lehit pa'er. So all Israel have a share in the world to come, as it is stated, and your people also shall be all righteous. They shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, for my name to be glorified. All right, so that's a powerful verse. Ve'amech kulam tzadikim. Right? Your people, all of them are tzadikim, are righteous. So this is why the Mishnah says all of Israel, every person who counts among the Jewish people earns a place in the world to come. All right, that's great. We're all in. Good job. We made it.
But this verse doesn't say anything about Olam Haba.
Oh, of course it doesn't. But it does talk about salvation and return to the land. And Isaiah is certainly seen as a messianic text as the rabbis as the rabbis receive it. So, but then the Mishnah, after that nice, very all-inclusive statement, spends the rest of the chapter dealing with all of the exceptions. So, ve'elu she'ein lahem chelek le'olam haba, and these are the ones who do not have a portion or a share in the world to come. The very first excluding factor, ha'omer ein tchiyat ha'metim min ha'torah. Right, the one who says there is no resurrection of the dead from the Torah. In other words, saying that the concept, the belief in the resurrection of the, or the reality of resurrection of the dead is not found within the Torah. Right, a person who denies that is out. Next, ve'ein Torah min hashamayim, and the person who says that Torah does not come from heaven. The Epicurus, and Epicurus, we saw this, was it last week? Oh no, we saw this in the Midrash. What's an Epicurus? Epicurus comes from the Greek word Epicurean. Might not necessarily mean Epicurean as a kind of a school of Greek philosophy, but someone who embraces heretical views of some sort. But it seems to be, in this context, since we're providing exceptions to people who are part of Israel who don't get a place in the world to come. So an Epicurus must include someone who is part of Israel, but who embraces some sort of belief or practice that is not kosher from the rabbi's perspective.
They don't like the texts or the approach of looking at secular, like secular information on biblical issues.
Well, let's see what Rabbi Akiva says. Rabbi Akiva Omer, af hakoreh basfarim achitzonim. Rabbi Akiva says, even one who reads in the external literature, outside texts, right? In other words, non-rabbinically sanctioned texts.
You mean like Sefer
No,
HaMaccabim?
if Rabbi Akiva says that, it would seem to be the case that reading non-rabbinic texts and being an Epicurus are two different things. Now, what Rabbi Akiva means by external literature is not clear. Does he mean anything that's not, by the rabbis? Does he mean stuff by Jews that's not accepted by the rabbis? It's not clear what any of these terms actually mean in this specific context.
Maybe it's the books that were not canonized.
Maybe, except as we saw last week, they read the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, and that wasn't canonized. And they're certainly aware of other texts.
Today, Orthodoxy would say documentary hypothesis. Would be
absolutely, and they would, any of these nowadays Orthodoxy would say, well, I want to say because there's plenty of Orthodox thinkers who do look at those texts, but traditionally, like the Book of Jubilees, for example, would be, one of these external works of literature.
Wouldn't it also be like comparing to the Code of Hammurabi?
It could be
Torah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it could be. All right, then Rabbi Akiva goes on, V'halochesh al makah, a person who whispers over a wound. In other words, you're kind of like whispering some verse of Torah with an expectation that it's going to cause healing, right? So you're using essentially words of Torah as magic for healing. That's not okay. V'omer, how do we know? Kol ha'machalesh or samtim mitzrayim lo asim alecha ki ani Adonai rofecha. Every illness that I placed upon Egypt, I will not place upon you, for I am the Lord your healer. Right? This might sound like we're not allowed to practice healing, right? That only God does healing. So in any event, we're not going to spend a lot of time focused on this right now, but it's just for flavor. Abba Shaul Omer, so we have Abba Shaul saying, Af hauget Hashem botiotav. Also one who pronounces the name by its letters, right? So this is understood to mean, somebody who reads Yud He Vav He as written, right? All right, and he also seems to be, it would seem to be talking about, it's not just a matter of reading it as it's written, but that it sounds like there were maybe other sectarian groups, Jewish groups, that did pronounce the divine name as part of their religious practice, and that was something that was not kosher from the rabbis. So I think it's, I look at this and to me this sounds a lot like people who are embracing beliefs and practices that are considered to be heretical, that don't follow kind of their core rabbinic beliefs.
Rabbi,
Yes.
regarding there is no resurrection of the dead from the Torah, is that referring to, because we have two parallel things now. We have the idea that we go to heaven after we die, and then we have the bodily resurrection that's supposed to happen in the world to come.
Correct.
Followed by some sort of connection with God in some heavenly sphere.
If you believe Maimonides.
Right. So which is, when they talk about resurrection of the dead, how are each of those tied to this idea? Or is this only about the bodily resurrection?
They are completely inconsistent. You cannot look at rabbinic texts and come up with a linear story about eschatology. Eschatology is kind of what happens after we die, right? In terms of this happens, then this happens, and this happens, and this is what it looks like at each of these stages. They're all over the place. I saw a passage by Maimonides as I was preparing for today, where he basically says it's all a mess. All of the passages in the Torah are all metaphors, and everything that the rabbis say are completely confusing and out of order. So don't spend too much time worrying about it, essentially, is what Maimonides.
So is there a way to look back and look at how ideas evolved from the rabbis on the two topics, and know which came first, or no?
Oh, resurrection of the dead or world to come?
Well, no, meaning like going to heaven after we die versus world to come.
Yes.
I don't know if you can elucidate on that.
No, between the two, I don't know if we can do it, but between those two, but we can certainly follow a course of belief in the concept of the resurrection of the dead, and we're going to look at that this morning a little, or this lunchtime.
And supposedly that starts with the Torah. So how do we?
Well, all right. So that's interesting. So the Mishnah here says that Tchiyat HaMeitim is in the Torah itself, and then when you look at the Gemara has a really hard time proving it. Right? It goes through attempt after attempt to demonstrate a verse in the Torah which seems to refer to the resurrection of the dead, and it cannot find one. So that's a problem. So,
would Orthodoxy say it didn't find one, or do they say it found all these examples?
well, it makes these suggestions saying, oh, if we interpret this particular verse in this way, it does midrash on particular verses. It's been a long time since I read that sugya in the Gemara, but it goes through like 10 or 11 different attempts to identify the source in, not just in Torah, but in Tanakh, where resurrection of the dead is stated. So let's see where it is stated. Right? This is the passage in the Tanakh, the only passage in the Tanakh which has a direct reference to the resurrection of the dead. Note, this is not Torah. This is Daniel. Daniel is set in the days of the Babylonian exile. So 6th century BCE. And but it is written during the 160s BCE, during the Maccabean revolt. So we get this verse in the last chapter of Daniel. The Rabim Mishenei Admat Afar, does that sound familiar? Yakitzu, Eile Lechaye Olam, Ve'eile Lecharafot Ledir'on Olam, Va'maskilim Yazhiru Kezohar Harakia, Umatzdikei Rabim Kachochavim Le'olam Va'ed. Right, so many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, Yakitzu, some to eternal life, others to reproaches, to everlasting abhorrence. And the knowledgeable will be radiant like the bright expanse of the sky. And those who lead the many to righteousness will be like the stars forever and ever. Right? Beautiful passage.
Is this why, could this be why the book of Daniel was canonized, to account for this theology?
Oh, I mean, there's other contemporaneous texts that have this theology.
But this wasn't this one of those that they did. It took a while for them to decide to include it.
I can't. I have to admit I am not expert on the canonization of the Book of Daniel. So other than to say that it is the latest of the books of the Bible to be written. If you look at, there's some of the books of the Maccabees speak very expansively on the resurrection of the dead. You might be somewhat familiar with the story of the Hannah and her 7 sons, the mother whose seven children are all brought before Antiochus and then tortured one at a time, trying to get them to commit heresy. And they talk very expansively about they're going to be resurrected to eternal life. So this seems to have been a belief that really emerged a lot in the 2nd century before the Common Era. It seems to have been pretty widespread because we see it in lots of other texts around this time. This idea of a resurrection. But again, so this passage in Daniel, I mean, this is a good passage, right? If they had said a person is a heretic who does not accept that resurrection is in the Bible, right? I would have been 100% on board for that statement, right? The problem is that this is Daniel. And so when the Talmud goes through all of its proofs, it knows about Daniel. It just saves it for the very end because it really doesn't want to have to use this one. So,
when it says, and the knowledgeable will be radiant, like the bright, is that kind of like the enlightened? Or...
Yeah, I think it is the maskilim. Yeah, who are these maskilim? I mean, in again, Shlomo, what's a maskil?
Open-minded.
Yeah.
Educated.
Yeah, so the Enlightenment is the Haskalah, right? So the Maskilim are enlightened Jews. In other words, Jews that have embraced modern Western thinking in the 1800s, right? So it was the Maskils were looked down upon by by Orthodoxy. They were heretics, which is kind of interesting here, because Daniel certainly says Maskil. These are people who have some sort of esoteric knowledge, right? So and notice also the term Zohar. I think that the name of the Zohar might come from this particular passage as well.
But Rabbi, there's some stories in the Tanakh about a prophet who resurrect the dead, like Elisha.
Yeah, so Elisha kind of lays down on this child who's died and brings it back to life.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that Talmud tries to use those. The problem is those that's not the same thing as this eschatological belief in the future resurrection of the dead for all who lived right, for judgment. Right. This is about somebody died and they got brought back to life in this world with all of its imperfections. It's not the same kind of resurrection of the dead that the rabbis are talking about.
Right.
All right. So this is there, right? We've seen the Mishnah. We've seen Daniel. Now we're going to take a little diversion into the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is in Qumran, so on the shores of the Dead Sea. We have 4Q521, so this refers, I think, to the 4th cave of the Qumran caves. They've each been identified with a number, and then number 521. And this particular scroll is referred to as the Messianic Apocalypse. If you Google this scroll, you'll find lots of discussions about this, comparing this to certain passages in the New Testament, because there are similarities and themes. But what this scroll tells us is that some Jewish group, this is clearly written in Hebrew, most likely a group that was active in Qumran, had an extensive belief about a Messiah. And so let's take a look. So this is what the scroll as found looks like, with all the pieces put back together. We're going to zoom in here. All right, so I think it's pretty clear. You see it? All right, so let's see if we can find out where this is.
Yichyeh.
Okay, so this says V'hametim yichyeh, right? So, and the dead will be given life. So so this is that what we just saw transcribed. The stuff in brackets are parts that we don't have, right? So you saw the parts were ripped away. So this is conjecture. So scholars try and reconstruct the text based on educated guesses. So the first line of this is Ki hashamayim v'ha'aretz yishma'u l'mashicho. For the heavens and the earth will listen to his Mashiach, his anointed one. V'chol asher bam lo yisog mitzvot kedushim. All that is in them, I guess heavens and earth, will not turn away from the precepts of the holy ones. And then it goes on. I'm going to jump right down to right here. 4 or 5, line 8. Matir asurim, pokeach ivrim, zokef kfufim. That sound familiar?
Yeah.
Right? He frees the captive, frees the prisoners, giving sight to the blind, straightening the bent over, or here it says the twisted.
It's in the morning blessings.
Yes, it is. And now we'll jump down. Ki yirafeh cholalim umetim yichayeh anavim yivaser. For he will heal the badly wounded, the chalalim, right? Will make the dead live. That's metim yichayeh. And then anavim yivaser. He'll proclaim good news to the poor. And then it goes on and on. So what does this tell us? So this is referred to as the Messianic Apocalypse. Apocalypse meaning something that's describing an end of days type of text. There's in this period of time of the kind of late second half of the Second Temple period, it's a very apocalyptic time. Beliefs in end of days or a final battle of sons of light against sons of darkness. These seem to be pretty widespread ideas. The group in Qumran, which are described as Essenes or someone like them, seems to have been a particularly rigorous group in terms of their beliefs and the requirements upon the community, although there's still lots of debate about who they were and what they represented. The scrolls that we have from Qumran date from as early as the 2nd century BCE into the 1st century CE. So we're talking, basically the second half of the Second Temple period. So in this particular passage, we have a reference to a Messiah. We're talking about some sort of future existence when all of the ills of the world are going to be restored. And we have this reference to making the dead live, right? So we've got a direct reference to resurrection. So what can this tell us? How might this relate to rabbinic beliefs in resurrection? Hard to know. What we can say is that the beliefs are in the air. Right? One of the big debates, and possibly one of the reasons that the rabbis specifically mentioned Tchiyat HaMeitim being a requirement for the world to come in that Mishnah, is because there were groups that rejected it. So probably the most well-known, at least from rabbinic texts, debate was between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, where the Pharisees did believe in the world to come, and the Sadducees did not. They rejected that concept. So it's possible that the rabbis in the Mishnah are referring to that debate.
Would the Sadducees have believed in individuals going to heaven after they die, or is that a super later idea?
No, Sadducees did not believe in that.
No, and so that's not just not believing that the whole nation comes to it.
Sadducees did not believe in angels. They did not believe in resurrection of the dead. I mean, they rejected the oral Torah.
Okay, so we died and then we were just gone.
Something like that, yeah. The problem is we don't really have Sadducean literature, so it's hard to. We only have the rabbis talking about the Sadducees, which we'll say the rabbis are maybe not the most reliable people for describing their arch they're theological arch enemies.
So would these Dead Sea Scrolls also be considered by Orthodox today as outside of rabbinic texts?
The problem is that Orthodox is,
There's a spectrum, I know.
I mean, look, the state of Israel has built the shrine of the book, right, as a shrine to these kinds of literature. I mean, they built the shape of it after the shapes of the jars that they found these things in, right? There's plenty of Orthodox research research by people who are Orthodox in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm sure that there's an entire division at Bar Ilan University that is studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. I have no doubt about that. If you're talking about Haredim probably would not look at this, but I think modern Orthodoxy certainly would.
And would they be looking for what's similar to what they currently believe and rejecting what's different?
No, I can't answer that. A person who is studying this as a scholar in a university, of which there are plenty who are Orthodox, are going to be, rigorous, following accepted, scientific rules for research, and that's how it works in the world of academia. So. All right, so let's. Oops. This is from 1 Samuel, and this is the Prayer of Hana. So we read this on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Hana is the mother of the prophet Samuel, and I'm not going to go through the whole story. Just she can't have children. She prays. She's blessed with a child. She comes back. She offers him as a Nazir to dedicate his life at the shrine. And she and while she's saying her prayer, the prophet Eli looks at her, thinks she's drunk, but it turns out she's just praying. Included in her prayer, she says the following: Adonai memit u'mechayeh, morid sheol vayal. The Lord deals death and gives life, casts down into Sheol and raises up.
So is she saying that her child will be sacrificed but then come back?
Absolutely not. We see this kind of language all over the Psalms, right? Where you're talking about death and life, Sheol, being cast into the pit, being brought back up, as a way of the psalmist saying, I was really miserable, and then now I'm not miserable, right? Or I'm right now really miserable, please make me not miserable, right? So references to I was down in the pit, and that's kind of standard metaphor for biblical era prayers. We happen to have Meimitu Mechayeh right here, gives death and gives life. But what are we saying? We're saying that God has the power to give death and to give life.
But then notice the order.
Yeah. Well, because that's the order of events for her, right?
Yeah.
She was miserable and crying, and then God remembered her and gave her a child, and so now feels like she's back in the world of the living. Right? We see this in lots of Psalms. This is not an unusual theme. It's a very heartfelt prayer in Hannah's mouth, though. So, Meimit u'mechayeh. Just what was it in the Dead Sea Scroll? Meitim yichyeh, right? Same order. Meitim yichyeh compared to Meimit u'mechayeh. So that's kind of interesting. For more flavor, Babylonian Talmud, right? Tractate Brachot, we've seen this lots of times, dealing with rules of the Shema, rules of the Amidah, and then later on it'll deal with the rules of blessings over food and blessings that we would say under other occasions. So we have this passage. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says, Haro'eh et chavero lachar shloshim yom, When a person sees his friend after 30 days of not seeing him, Omer Baruch Shechianu v'kimanu v'gianu lazman hazeh, right? You say the Shechianu, right? Blessed are you who has given us life, who has sustained us, and who's enabled us to reach this time, or brought us to this time. All right. That's after 1 month. La'achar 12 chodesh, after 12 months. Omer Baruch Mechayei HaMeitim, right? Blessed are you who gives life to the dead. You haven't seen somebody for 12 months, right? That's interesting, right? But it's beautiful, right? I haven't seen you in so long.
I thought you were dead.
This is before instant messaging, right? You really didn't know if this person was alive or not, right?
It's like a little ironic, you know.
Yeah, you know. Amar. So now we're gonna get a little explanation. Amar Rav. Eina mit mishtakech min alev el lachar 12 chodesh. So Rav says, a person, a dead is not forgotten from the heart until after 12 months. All right.
Ooh.
And the heart being, heart and mind, right? So you're kind of thinking your regular thoughts, right? Person's not fully, when a person, I guess this sounds like it's talking about someone who's in mourning, right? So that for that first year, the deceased is kind of in our minds always, right? And then after a year, it's not constant, right? So, and he gives a proof text, Shenamar nishkachti kamet milev hayiti kichli oved. He says, I am forgotten as a dead man out of mind. I am like a lost vessel. So again, we've got a psalmist who's feeling down and is describing himself as somebody who's like he's dead. But what's the drash that Rav is using here? Forgotten as a dead man, right? So he's so to be forgotten as a dead man, I'm like a lost vessel. So what he's saying is that if you haven't seen somebody for 12 months, then we're making a comparison to that person. It's like they were dead, and so we say the bracha mechei hametim. He gives life to the dead. Right? So this is a rabbinic text, right? This is in the Talmud. So that's pretty interesting because now we're talking about mechei hametim not being read literally, right? It's not, resurrection of the body. We're talking about, I haven't seen you in a really long time and I missed you and I didn't know what was going on with you. And I'm so glad to see you. And it's like you've been brought back to life for me, right? Very personal.
I like it. It's really beautiful.
Right? So I'm not sure. No, I am sure that this is not what the rabbis had in mind when they talk about mechei hametim in the Amidah, right? We're using this bracha, for a different kind of purpose. All right, we're done with that. We're done with resurrection of the dead. So where does that leave? What it leaves us with is the concept of Tchiyat Meitim was a core rabbinic belief. Right? It was one of the important things that the rabbis believed, and they included mentioning specifically these words of Mechei Meitim in some conjugation of 5 times in this one prayer. Right? That tells us how important it is. They do mention other acts of divine power, but none of them get repeated in the way that resurrection of the dead gets repeated in here. We've got different solutions if moderns are uncomfortable with this concept. Mike referred to us to the Mechayei HaKol, gives life to everything, that Reform Siddurim has done. Sim Shalom, you give life to the dead. Your great mercies give life to the dead. Your master, Melech Meimitu Mechayeh, king who causes death and brings life, translates it as you are master of life and death. Perhaps not so bad. The ending, V'ne'eman ata l'chayot meitim, faithful are you in giving life to the dead. But then when we get to the Chatima, the closing blessing, Baruch atah Hashem mechei hameitim, praise are you Adonai, master of life and death. We kind of fudged it a little bit. Yeah. Susan.
So would you say as a modern reader that you could look at this as being who keeps the transmission of the culture from generation to generation, because we remember those who are, by remembering those who are past, we are enriched, something like that.
Yeah, so I think a lot of, I think that concept I think is used often when we're talking about resurrection of the dead, that it's not physical bodily resurrection, but we're keeping a person's memory alive. You know, we're keeping their values, their teachings alive. Yeah, I think that's I would say a modern way of wrestling with this concept.
So if I were davening with you, would that be an okay thing for me to be able to say and be true to my beliefs?
I hope that we have conveyed the concept that the Siddur speaks in poetry and in metaphor, and that meanings of things, you know, something can have multiple meanings at the same time or speak in different ways to different people. I think that's what this, I mean, that's how I read the Siddur. You know, do I believe in a physical bodily resurrection of the dead? Who knows, right? Like, I'm not living my life based on that, on that assumption, right? So, and frankly, that's what Maimonides says. He says, don't worry about it. Right? And he gets, because he downplays it, he gets accused of being a heretic. And he has to write his final writing, the last Igeret, the last epistle that he writes, is defending himself against charges of heresy for not sufficiently supporting the resurrection of the dead. And so he has an extensive essay where he tries to fit the concept of the resurrection of the dead into the rest of his beliefs. But essentially, he doesn't, you know, he says, yeah, there'll be a resurrection of the dead. We'll live again, then we'll die again, and then go to the real eternal life, which is basically the intellect rejoining the divine intellect, right? So it's a completely bodiless existence. That's the ultimate goal. You know, for Maimonides, the ultimate goal is acquiring wisdom and knowledge. That's what we should be doing in this life, and that's the award waiting for us in the world to come, right? So he really, so the concept of a bodily resurrection for Maimonides is just antithetical to everything that is most important to him. So Susan, you're welcome to.
Rabbi, you mentioned earlier that you would deal with this the idea of the resurrection of the dead. So are you done with it? Is this, or are you
I'm done with what I've prepared to say about it. If folks have any questions or comments about it.
So what do they mean in that passage where it's 5 times that God will resurrect the dead?
They mean that God is going to, I mean, when the rabbis are putting this in the Siddur, they believe that after we die, you know, we're going to be buried, and we will mostly decay, but there'll be a little bone in the back of our neck that doesn't decay, and then when the Messiah comes, the lots of miraculous things will happen, including all of the dead will be brought back to life with their souls returned to their bodies. They will return to Jerusalem. There will be a final judgment, and then go on to the world to come, or the Garden of Eden, or something like that. The rabbis ask lots of questions. Are we going to come back clothed or not clothed?
Is this why we need to be buried underground for the reasons you just stated in Judaism?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think similar things are believed in Islam, right? Which is, you know, we hear like it's such a an insult to not have the body back, right? Because then a person can't, you know, they can't have their future existence, you know, because you need to be buried in the earth. You need to go back. You know, the body needs to go back into the earth where it came from, so that it'll be prepared to be resurrected at some point in the future. Probably there's lots of rabbinic statements about what it's going to look like, but they don't all agree with each other. And so
Did they
say with any sort of definitiveness, this is what here's what it's going to look like. This is what we just don't. It just doesn't exist.
Did they say anything about whether people would be coming back in their 60s or in the prime of their life or
I
in
think
their
that's a question people like to ask now. I'm not sure if the Talmud deals with that specific question.
So when the
Cindy, you get to
passage has 5
choose.
times mentioning that God gives life and resurrects the dead, there's nothing specific. It just sort of maybe an overall idea of the.
Oh, like something specific to the number 5?
Pardon me?
Are you talking about, is there particular significance to the number 5?
No. I'm just saying when it was mentioned that they were referring maybe just to God's power, nothing specific about how the resurrection takes
Yeah, so
place.
this doesn't go into any of the mechanics, right? We've got these two words, mechaye metim, life and death, right? So God giving life to those who have died, right? So those appear together. We don't, this is not I wouldn't call this a theological treatise,
Mhm.
right? It's a prayer. And so we mentioned this concept, which is, I think safe to say this is the main theme of this prayer. And so we mention it a lot of times.
I think this is a great topic that we can have a week-long course in.
Yes, we could. But we're going to move on to a topic that is even more important for the day, which is Mashiv HaRuach Umarid HaGeshem.
Has the rain come yet?
Mashiva, not quite. The sky is getting darker. The Mashiv HaRuach, causing the wind to blow, Umarid HaGeshem, causing the rain to fall. All right, so this gets included, as I mentioned earlier, on Shmini Atzeret to Pesach. We add these 4 words into the prayer, and that's this. And I think the addition of these 4 words is what makes me really think about this prayer of Gevurot being. It's describing manifestations of divine power, right? Because as much as human beings have been able to harness the world around us, we have not been able to control when it's windy and when it rains. Right? These are things that are out of our control, and they're in God. They're ultimately in God's control. The rabbis in Masechet Tanit, in the tractate of Tanit, which means fasting, the opening pages of Tanit discuss this addition to the Amidah and when it needs to be done, and in what way it needs to be done, and all sorts of theological beliefs around it. And they talk about 2 different ways of referring to rain in the liturgy. So there's the azkara. Azkara is to mention something. And then there's bakasha, to petition for something, right? To ask for something. And both of these appear in the Amidah. We have a time when we mention God's bringing rain, and we have a time when we ask for God's bringing rain. If you look in the weekday Siddur, I'm looking at the Siddur Sim Shalom for weekdays on page 39, the very top of the page. We'll get to this in a future week, but it begins Barech Aleinu Adonai Eloheinu et hashana azot vet kol minei tvatal tova. Right? Bless us, Adonai our God, this year. Bless this year in all kinds of produce for good. And then it says from December 5th to Passover, V'tein talu matar livracha, and give dew and rain for blessing, al pnei adama, upon the face of the earth, the sabenu mituva, and let it be satisfied from your goodness, and bless our year like all the good years. Blessed are you who blesses Adonai, who blesses the years. So this is the other mention of rain. So one of these is an azkara, and one of these is a bakasha. So we'll just cut to the chase here. This one is an azkara. Mashiv haruach u'merid hageshem. This is an azkara. This is when we mention rain as a manifestation of divine power. We are not formally asking for rain. Right? And in Masechet Tanit, which in talking about fasting is primarily concerned with public fasts that are declared during droughts. And so there's a series of dates in the year after which a community will start proclaiming public fasts if the rains haven't come yet, and the fast will get more and more intense as the year goes on. So Shmini Atzeret, that's right towards the end of Sukkot, so we're talking early to mid-October usually. This is not yet a time for asking God to bring rain. This is a time for just mentioning it, right? If things happen in the normal way, then we should be getting rain sometime soon after the Shmini Atzeret, but we don't need to ask for it yet, right? If it happens, though, we know that this is God's doing. The later one, which we don't start saying till December 5th, which is quite a bit later than Shmini Atzeret, that one, that's when we start formally petitioning God for rain. That's when we start asking for it. So this is an azkara for rain. And what you will see, not in our Siddurim, but in many Siddurim, you'll see from Pesach through Sukkot, this expression, morid hatal, you cause the dew to fall, right? So remember, in the land of Israel, like in California, there's essentially two seasons. There's a rainy season and a dry season. So Passover through Sukkot, that's the dry season, but the dew still comes down, and we depend on that. And so mentioning morid hatal as, let's say, the summertime manifestation of divine power is something that gets added in the land of Israel. And there's discussion in the Talmud about whether or not these things are said outside of the land of Israel, including in Babylonia, which has a completely different weather pattern than the land of Israel. It doesn't have a dry season and a rainy season. It's more varied over the course of the year. So there's discussions about, are we praying just for the land of Israel, for everywhere? Outside of the land of Israel, in Sephardi custom, they do include morid hatal. And Ashkenazi custom does not include morid hatal. I don't know, I kind of feel like they should have, since we have so many non-Ashkenazim in our synagogues, that Sim Shalom should have included morid hatal as an option for Sephardim. But it doesn't. But I wanted to just include this. If you're ever in Israel, everybody says morid hatal in the summer months. If you happen to find yourself in a Sephardic synagogue, you'll hear it, and sometimes people leading services might throw in a morid hatal at that time. All right, but now we got a problem. The vowels. What are the correct vowels for this word? In Sim Shalom, I have Gashem. I put down Geshem earlier. Mike, what does Mishkan Tefilah have?
It has Gashem.
Gashem. Anybody have a Geshem in the Siddur they're looking at? All right, we got two possibilities. Geshem or Gashem. So the question is, what is the difference between them? They mean exactly the same. This is the difference. A comma and a period, right? So I've mentioned this before in my teaching that with certain words, when a word is in the pausal position in the sentence, right? It's basically by a period or a major break in a sentence. Something changes in the word. We see this all over the Torah, vayomer versus vayomar, words that are segolates, that have an three letters with an this happens to them. So Geshem becomes Gashem when there's a period there, right? There's lots of examples. Borei peri ha.
It's
I'm thinking if you for wine.
Geffen.
Geffen or Gaffen?
I say Geffen. Tomato.
It should be Gaffen. Borei peri ha Gaffen, because it's the end of the sentence. It's a period. It's the pausal form. So it should be Gaffen. Some people will say Geffen though. So the question is, which is the correct one to use here? Is it Geshem or Gashem? And it really comes down to, do we think we need to pause or do we need to continue? That's how I understand it anyways. So here's if we're going to take the Geshem version, right? Which means that it's got a comma. So we have, you are eternally mighty, Lord. You give life to the dead and have great power to save, cause the wind to blow and the rain to fall, sustain life with loving kindness, give life to the dead, etc. So what does it do? It puts this expression, Mashiva Ruach U'Morid Gashem, in the list. It's in a list of things, statements, that are all expressions of divine power, right? So that's why it would be Geshem with a comma after it. Now, if it's got a period, Gashem, then it's going to be a little different, right? So you give life to the dead and have great power to save, cause the wind to blow and the rain to fall, period. Gashem. Now we need to start a new sentence, right? You sustain life with loving kindness, etc. Right? Now, is the difference in meaning? I don't think there's any difference in meaning. We're not the theological concepts are not changing in any way. What I think it's really a syntactical issue, right? Do we want to have a period there, or do we want to include Mashiv Haruach Min Gashem among the list, right? Maybe by
It
having
seems like it's
Gashem.
run-on. There's so many run-on sentences, you know,
Oh,
and
that's not a problem for the Siddur.
well, I think it is a huge problem.
Yeah.
And
So
if you do put more periods, it gives more emphasis to a thought that's just succinct, and your brain can manage that and then start with the next one. I think this run-on business that you constantly see puts you in this mode of, it almost just makes it less emphasized, if you know what I mean.
yeah, so the problem is that we're trying to think about the Siddur with English grammar. And by the way, modern Hebrew does this also, right? I mean, you can't have a run-on sentence like this in modern Hebrew either. But this is an ancient language in which punctuation did not exist.
That's true.
Right? So, which is why if you compare one Siddur to the next, the commas and the periods are all over the place, right? There's no consistency at all between Siddurim. And that will be true from Siddurim within the same movement, right? Ultimately, an editor is going to have to decide whether and where and which punctuation to include. And also the original Siddurim didn't have vowels necessarily either. And so we've got this expression, Marid HaGashem or Geshem, like which is correct? I don't know which is correct. Putting commas or periods anywhere, that's, we're kind of putting punctuation onto something which was originally not written with punctuation, right? It's almost these snippets of phrases that are manifestations of divine power. So how do we want to think about that? Do we want to put a hard stop after causing the rain to fall? Well, maybe we do. Maybe, after being in a drought, maybe we do want to have a hard stop there to make more emphasis. So I don't know what the correct answer is for this one. I think Sephardim, though, tend to have Geshem, and Ashkenazim tend to have Gashem.
Tomato or tomato?
Yeah, hi, Lev Shalem. Looking at Lev Shalem, what do they, for Mashiv Haruach and Marid HaGashem, they do Gashem and then put a comma there. But that just seems wrong. You're gonna have a comma, it should be Geshem. But they also add, I'll give them credit for this, from Pesach until Shmini Atzeret, some add Marid Hatal. So that's good. And I'm looking now at Koren. Koren has Geshem. And Koren, I'll try and hold this up. No, hold it. You'll notice Koren does not put lots of commas or periods in. At the end of every line, it just leaves it blank in most places. Whereas, if they were going to have a continuous, they'd probably put a comma there, but I think they try and minimize their use of commas for this reason, that it's we're imposing some rules of punctuation on a language that originally didn't have it, at least when it was written. So, and I think this is probably a good place for us to stop.